Final Boss is a game that was created out of our love for video games from our childhood. If you want to get news about our game, check our website finalbosscardgame.com and follow us on Facebook or Twitter. When you open the game, you will find the following content inside. 1 rulebook, 59 power-up cards, 16 enemy cards, 5 final boss cards, 12 power gem counters, 15 victory point counters, and 1 player 1 token. Now let's take a look at what's on a card. In the top left and top right corners, there are the attack and health values respectively. Most cards have attack and health values, but some cards do not. As long as you have a power-up card in your inventory space, you can add its attack and health values to your overall attack and health stats. These stats will be used to fight enemies, which we will explain later. The stats are sometimes described as number/number. For example, 1/2 or 3/3. The first one being the attack value and the second one being the health value. At the top of the card, in the middle, there is the name of the card. And directly under the name of the card, there is the type of the card. The text at the bottom of the card explains the effect of the card and specifies the type of effect. All cards in the game have one effect, including power-up cards, enemy cards, and final boss cards. Let's take a look at the different types of power-up cards. Power-ups are the cards that players hold in their hands. There are 4 types of power-ups. Characters. A player may only activate 1 character card in his inventory at any time. If you wish to change your inventory character, you have to discard the old one first. Weapons. A player may only activate 1 weapon card in his inventory at any time. If you wish to change your weapon, you can swap it with a card in your hand, without the need to discard the old one. Items. A player may only activate 5 item cards in his inventory at any time. If you wish to change an item, you can swap it with a card in your hand, without the need to discard the old one. And finally, we have the specials. Special cards cannot be activated in the inventory, but are played directly from the hand. Consider them as one-time use spells. There are 3 types of effects. Each effect type works following a different mechanic, and all cards in the game have one effect type that determine how that card can be played. Passive effects depicted in white are active whenever the card is active on the table. They are persistent effects, and the card doesn't need to be discarded after using the effect. Combat effects, depicted in orange, can only be played during combat, on the combat pile, which I will explain later. Cards with combat effects are placed on the combat pile, and when the effect is resolved, the card is discarded. Instant effects, depicted in yellow, can be played at any time, and their effect is immediate. After the effect is resolved, discard the card. Enemies and final bosses also have effects, but these are either passive, which means that the effect takes place for as long as the enemy or final boss remains active on the table, or instant, which means that the effect is applied immediately as soon as the enemy or final boss card is revealed. Also, like most power-ups, enemies and final bosses have attack and health values, which are confronted to the attack and health of the player during combat. Next, we will explain the setup and game rules for a 4 players game. In case of a different number of players, the rules are almost the same, except that a few things, such as the number of cards and power gems for each player, changes. First of all, shuffle the power-ups, enemies and final bosses decks. Deal 5 cards to each player. Give 1 power gem to each player. And the first player to begin the game is selected randomly and gets the player 1 marker. That player is the player 1 for that round. Then each player looks at their own power-ups and can activate any characters, weapons and items. They can also keep them in hand if they prefer to, although it's usually better to activate them. Also, remember the limitation of 1 character, 1 weapon and 5 items active at a time for each player. Every round, players will face enemies in order to collect victory points. Players can collect victory points by either defeating an enemy or by making other players get killed by enemies. At the beginning of each round, 2 new enemies are drawn from the enemy deck, but do not reveal them. These 2 enemies stay dormant in the middle of the table. Then, player 1 assigns the first enemy to any player they want, even to themselves. At this point, players are also able to do inventory management. They can swap the power-ups that they have activated on the table or activate new power-ups. Actually, players can do this at any time as long as no combat is taking place. Inventory management cannot be done during a combat. The enemy assigned by player 1 is then revealed and combat takes place. Each enemy is fought individually. The enemy versus the player confronting it. The first thing is to apply the effect of the enemy, whatever it is. For example, for as long as this enemy is active, the inventory cards of all players are disabled. This means that any character, weapon and items that any player have active don't have any effect and don't contribute to the power of that player. Another example is this card. The moment it is revealed, its power values, attack and defense, are set to whatever attack and defense the player facing it has. But if that player somehow increases their stats during the combat, this enemy would not benefit from that because the effect is instant and not passive. After applying the enemy effect, the actual fight will take place. But before that, players have the chance to play combat effects into the combat pile to try to push the odds in their favor. For each combat there is 1 combat pile, where any player may play any power-up cards which have combat effects. Starting from the player combatant and continuing clockwise, players will play 1 combat card with a combat effect face up on top of the combat pile, either from their hand or from their inventory. It doesn't matter if the card is a special character, weapon or item, as long as it has a combat effect. A player can choose to pass if they wish. At the end, the combatant can place a second and last card in the combat pile if they wish to. This means that each player can play a maximum of 1 card in each combat pile, except the combatant, which can play up to 2. Then, start resolving the combat pile from top to bottom. This means that the last card that was played is resolved first. Each combat effect is resolved by the player who played it. After that, discard it. An exception is if the enemy or combatant are killed or the enemy is somehow removed from the game while resolving the combat pile. Then the remaining cards in the combat pile are discarded without their effects being applied. If the enemy is reassigned to another player, so just keep resolving the same combat pile as normal, as in this case it is considered to be the same combat. Remember that cards with instant effects can be played at any time, including in the middle of the combat pile, and take effect immediately after being played. There is another resource that a player can use if things are going badly for them. These are the power gems. A player can discard a power gem at any time to draw 3 power-up cards. This counts as an instant effect, but you can only use 1 power gem for each combat. After the combat pile has been emptied or discarded, resolve the combat. Calculate the attack and health of enemy and player in combat, counting any bonus or penalizers each side might have gotten from any combat effects or passive effects. Enemies strike first, so the combatant must have at least 1 more health value than the enemy has attacked to survive. If the enemy hits the combatant so that their health gets to 0 or lower, that player dies. They discard all their cards, both from inventory and in hand, and all the other players get 1 victory point. Then the combatant which died draws 5 power-ups, and they can activate any character, weapon and item they want in their inventory. The enemy is discarded face up into the cemetery. If the combatants survive, then they strike the enemy. If the enemy's health goes to or below 0, it is killed. The combatant gains 1 victory point and draws 1 power-up card, because they get the drop from the enemy corpse. The enemy is discarded face up into the cemetery. If neither the combatant nor the enemy died, discard the enemy into the cemetery and nothing else happens. Some enemies have effects that are active when the enemy is on the cemetery. Remember to apply them. After the first combat of the round, the next dormant enemy is assigned by the player next to player 1 clockwise to any player they want, including themselves. Then reveal the enemy and proceed with the combat in the same way. After that combat takes place, the round is over. Player 1 passes the player 1 marker to the next player clockwise, and everyone draws 1 power-up. Each player can have a maximum of 5 cards in hand at this point. If a player has more than 5 cards in hand, they have to discard or activate cards until having 5. A new round then starts, and is played the same way as the previous one. If any deck runs out of cards at any point, pick the cards discarded or in the cemetery, except the one on top, and then reshuffle them and keep drawing from there. Once the player 1 marker has completed a cycle around the players, meaning that the player who had it first gets it again, a final boss appears. Players can activate any inventory cards they wish, and then one final boss is drawn and revealed. A fight against the final boss is resolved almost the same as fights against regular enemies. But a couple of things are different. The final boss will attack all the players at the same time, because it's so overpowered. Each player, as well as the final boss, is considered one side of the combat. Then each player can play a maximum of 3 cards on the combat pile, starting from the player with most victory points. Still, there is one single combat pile for all players. If a player is killed by the final boss, they die normally and don't gain anything nor draw more cards. If a player survives the attack of a final boss, they earn 1 victory point. Then surviving players can strike back. If a player somehow manages to kill the final boss, that player gets 2 additional victory points on top of the one they got from surviving, for a total of 3. If a player kills the final boss, any next player still has the chance to kill it also, meaning that multiple players can kill the final boss. And after the combat against the final boss is resolved, whatever the outcome, the game is over. The player with more victory points wins the game. If there is a tie in victory points, the player with more power gems wins. If there is also a tie in power gems, then the player with the highest attack value wins. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, put it in the comments below, and remember to check our website finalbosscardgame.com and follow us on Facebook or Twitter for news regarding our game.